So I started making videos of what I'm doing out here at the nursery at the farm back in I don't know, maybe October. Like it was sometime late 2023. Or I'm sorry, 2022. It's now early 2023, and I've been having a ton of fun, expressing myself in this way. And I have I just there's so many things that I want to talk about and make videos about. And one of those things, and I haven't made any videos on this yet, is composting. And so composting is something that I'm really passionate about, and that I'm very into. I'm a compost nerd, you could say. And the reason I haven't made any videos yet, partly it's just time and busyness, but it's also partly I haven't been doing a lot of physical composting. I've learned a lot about composting. I've definitely done composting in my life, but recently I haven't been doing a ton of it, and so I just haven't been filming it. But now I'm gearing up to start doing a lot more composting in 2023, and I feel like it's finally time to start talking about composting on this platform and just discussing it. So, let's just dive in. So, compost, what is it? The word compost is kind of a loose definition, in my opinion, and I guess part of what I'm trying to do is put more of a concrete definition onto compost and just define it a little bit more. It's getting a little windy. I hope you can still hear me. Generally speaking, compost is organic matter that's broken down. It's no longer fresh. And organic matter is just something that was recently alive, right? So there's a lot of different things that qualify as organic matter. Yard waste, manure, dead animals, food scraps, anything you can think of that was recently alive. And the process by which that organic matter goes from its fresh form when it was recently alive to a broken down, composted form, the mechanism is microbes. It's microorganisms that are eating that material. It's food for them, and they're breaking it down into base components. And so we often think of, other critters being involved in compost, such as worms, composting worms or insects and things like that. They are vital to the composting process, all of those larger creatures. But those larger creatures, for the most part, they eat the microbes. The microbes eat the actual organic matter. Is generally how that works. So I like to look at composting the same way I look at growing plants, which is I'm farming microbes. Composting is a microbe farming process. You're really trying to create ideal conditions for the microbes in the mix so that they will break down the material efficiently and by reducing pathogens and on a time scale that is appropriate for you and your goals. So again, to summarize, the composting process is done by microbes, right? It's a process where we're breaking down organic material into base components and we're growing microbes. And so that end compost, the result, what you want out of compost is, first of all, you want to deal with something that would otherwise be a waste, food scraps, manure, etc. You want to use that as an actual resource instead of as a waste product. You want to turn it into something that you can then use either in your garden, in your landscape, in your farm, which is compost. Now, compost does have a lot of available nutrients. Some people do consider it a fertilizer, and it certainly acts that way. However, it also has a lot of microbes, and I really look to compost more as an inoculation as compared instead of a fertilizer. It does certainly do some fertilizing, but I'm really interested in what microbes the compost is providing to inoculate my growing space, to inoculate my plants with beneficial microbes that they're going to be in symbiotic relationship with. Most of our agricultural and urban soils are if not completely devoid, they're certainly depleted of the native microorganisms that are required for healthy plants and healthy ecosystems. Through various destructive farming and land management practices, we've killed a lot of these microbes over the past several hundred years, all across the world. And in this video, we don't need to get too in depth into what those practices are, but these microbial communities and also some of the macro organisms that survive with them, such as worms and bugs, etc., they do not handle tillage very well, and they do not handle bare soil very well, and we have a lot of that. And so we have really pushed them to their limits and pushed them out of our spaces. And compost is a great way to re-inoculate, to bring them back in to the fold, because compost is a way to grow these organisms in excessive numbers and then apply it back out into the fields. So how do we go about making compost? What does the process look like? This is not going to be a recipe or like a really strict how-to. I just want to kind of overview what some of the common practices are, just, some kind of getting started thoughts and considerations type things. First off, you're going to want to gather your materials, okay? I like to use containers. So you kind of, think of it like you're baking a cake. You're going to take measurements. Well, you're making some compost. It can be helpful to take measurements. So using containers like these plastic tubs and buckets is great. And you want to measure out your materials into 3 different categories. You have your carbon sources, which are things like wood chips, maybe some sawdust like what's right there. Finished compost, there's some leaf compost right there that's finished. There's some thermophilic hot compost right there that's finished from an old batch. That can be considered carbon material. Sometimes people call carbon material brown material. You could also use fall leaves, right? Not green leaves, but leaves that fell in the fall would also be considered a brown material. Next, you're gonna wanna grab some green materials. So this could be self-explanatory, but it can be a little bit more complex than that. So anything that's green, typically a green material. So think green leaves, grass clippings, that sort of thing. But also most food scraps are green, so food scraps can be green, coffee grounds, that sort of stuff. And the last category you're looking at is going to be high nitrogen. Now the high nitrogen food is going to be things like manure, bone meal, blood meal. These are foods that have a lot of energy, they have a lot of nitrogen in them. Seeds can also be a good source of high nitrogen, legumes. And not just the seed of the legume, but the entire leguminous plant, if it's healthy, can be a high source of nitrogen. Now, if it's not a very healthy legume, it's going to be more of a green material. So there's some nuances. But don't get too caught up on this. Like I said, these are just guidelines, and gathering the high nitrogen material really is only going to matter if you're making hot compost. So this is a good time to segue into different ways to make compost. Now, keeping in mind, our main goal with compost is we're trying to use a waste product, and we're trying to create an end product that has diverse microbes and nutrients in it. At the same time, we may have other goals. I want this compost to be completed in X amount of time. I want it to take me X amount of work. Another really important consideration is I don't want pathogens in my compost, right? Especially if we're using manures and food scraps and things like this, there can be human and plant pathogens in there that we want to deal with responsibly. So there's other considerations and constraints. So, let's go over a couple of different ways to make compost. You have thermophilic or hot compost. So that is a process that, based on your ingredients, you're trying to put enough food in there that the microbes are going to grow so fast they're going to produce a massive amount of heat, get that pile up to above 131 degrees for a certain amount of time. There's standards for how long it has to be above certain temperatures to kill the pathogens. Okay, so that's one way to do it. Thermophilic hot composting will kill pathogens based on temperature. Another way is static composting, or cold composting, sometimes people call it, which is you don't mix up enough materials for things to hit that thermophilic range. The temperature still may increase, but not to 131 degrees. Because you're not killing pathogens with heat, cold composting takes a lot longer. So typically you're going to leave that pile sit for maybe upwards of a year. And just over time, the biodiversity and competition within the pile is going to reduce pathogens to safe levels. And then the third way to compost that I want to talk about, and this is not to say that these are the only ways to compost, but again, some common ways, is worm composting, which is kind of a segment off of cold composting. Worms definitely don't like it above like 95 degrees, so it's definitely not thermophilic. But worm composting can happen faster than typical static composting because the worms can actually kill a lot of pathogens. Most pathogens can't survive a trip through the gut of the worm, and so if the worms can process all of your material, they've killed a lot of the pathogens. Static composting and worm composting are both going to be a lot less energy intensive because hot composting has to be flipped. If you've heard of flipping your compost, turning your compost, that's hot composting. There's a couple reasons for that, which we'll get into in a minute, but like I said, static composting, maybe you're leaving it for a year. Worm compost, if you can make sure that the worms are getting through all of the food, you might have good worm compost in half that time or less, depending on your recipes and your worms and your environment and many, many things. So those are kind of the three basic ways that I like to think of composting. So anyway, given all that, maybe you're a compost nerd like me, maybe you're not. Your interest level is going to vary from person to person, and also your level of time and energy and resources and all that. And so my general advice with composting is just try it. If you want to make any type of compost, just try it. Don't be worried about getting the recipe exactly right. Don't be worried about getting the materials exactly right. Just mix some stuff up, whatever you have on hand, and see what happens, and you'll learn from it. And no matter what you do, it won't be a waste. Even if your compost, quote unquote, fails, that the hot compost doesn't get hot enough, or the worms don't like the environment that you create, whatever, you're still preventing material from going to the landfill. And given enough time, that material will turn into a usable compost for your space, right? It may not be on the time scale you were hoping, may not go exactly how you hoped, but it will work out in the end in some way. Right here is a perfect example of that. This is you have this kind of weird humped shaped pile here. And what happened was, well, first of all, that third of the pile is just leaves, okay? Then this third is a failed batch of thermophilic compost, and this third is a separate failed batch of thermophilic compost. And what I mean by failed is that I was messing around with my recipes. I didn't have all the materials available to me that I wanted. I didn't think I had enough of the high nitrogen and green materials, but I wanted to see what would happen. So I mixed them all up with a bunch of carbon, and I got above 131 degrees. And I was up there for however long it has to be, 3 or 4 days. And then I went to flip the pile. I'll talk in a minute about why you might flip the pile, but I flipped the pile, and I did not get back up to 131 like I was supposed to. So the pile failed its heat requirements to kill pathogens, right? Well, I said, oh well, and I piled it over here and decided, well, now you're a static pile. So now here she sits, and let's see. This pile is at almost a little bit past 6 months. This one's at about 4 months. So, we're still a ways out from being finished, but I learned a lot from that experience about what types of materials work, right? And, that's going to change based on how hot or cold it is outside. There's a lot of nuance to recipes is what I'm saying. But I learned a lot. And this material behind me, it's either going to be static compost in a year, or as I build out my worm composting abilities here, that food can go to worms. Worms love to eat finished thermophilic compost and failed thermophilic compost. As long as it's not going to be too hot for them, they love eating it. So that's great worm food. But yeah, real quick, I'll just a note on flipping. So hot compost, only the middle gets hot, right? And so if we want to kill pathogens, we're only killing pathogens in the middle. So there are recommended, guidelines to follow as far as how often to flip the compost and what temperatures need to be for a certain amount of time to kill all the pathogens. You can imagine the center gets hot, you flip it and try to put some of the top and sides into the center, get it hot again. You have to do this multiple times to cycle all of the material through that hot center of the pile. And you can find guidelines online. I want to say it's above 131 for 3 days. And depending on the regulations you're looking at, you might have to flip it 3 or 5 times in order to get all that material through the center. I think organic regulations is 5 times. If you're not regulated, I think you could do a reasonable job getting all the material through in 3 or 4 flips. If you get hotter than 131, you can actually have it be held at that temperature for less amount of time. I don't have that all memorized, but say you're 150 degrees, you might be able to do it for 2 days or something instead of 3. You do want to be careful. If you get above 165, 170, start getting like 175, you're getting into a range where you could have a fire breakout. At that temperature, you're generally using oxygen faster than it can diffuse into the pile, which means you're going to have reduced oxygen conditions, which means some anaerobic or facultative anaerobic microbes. This is maybe TMI for people that don't want to nerd out on compost, but the end of that is that in those conditions, a lot of the microbes produce alcohol, which can combust. So you start getting above, like I said, right around 165 to 175. That's where you want to start being concerned. If you get that hot, you You can turn the pile, or you can poke big holes in it to kind of let some steam out, so to speak. And yeah, so that's kind of something to be aware of if you add too much green or nitrogen food, or especially if you make a huge, massive pile. There's risks for this. On a smaller pile, probably a lot less likely for it to catch on fire. Some general notes. I think the best compost is the most diverse compost, and the way to get diverse compost is by having diverse inputs. So the more diverse your inputs, the better off you are. Add a lot of different things, clippings from many different types of plants, food waste from many different meals, manure from different animals, right? Maybe grab a pinch of garden soil, a pinch of soil from the forest, a pinch of soil from your lawn, maybe throw in a few rocks. Wood chips from many, many different types of trees. And with wood chips, preferably aged if you can. Aged wood chips are going to be a lot better than fresh wood chips. But use whatever you got. And when you're making your pile, mix things up really, really well and get things to a good moisture content at the beginning. It's tough to wet the compost pile or mix it up more after you've already made it up. You don't want it sopping and dripping wet, but you don't want it bone dry either. You want it, like moist. Like if you grab a handful of this stuff and squeeze it as hard as you can with your fist, maybe a few drops come out, but no more than that, no less. Again, this is all, this is kind of vague stuff. There's a lot of nuance. Like, play around with it. Don't take any of this as set in stone rules. I don't know. That's probably enough of you guys just listening to me talk and staring at my head. Like I said, I'm going to be doing a lot more composting, the actual work of it, in 2023. I'm actually gearing up to be collecting food waste around town where I live, near Hillsborough, North Carolina. If anybody, I know a lot of you are tuning in from all over the place, but if anyone's tuning in from that area, I would love to pick up your food waste. Reach out to me. And yeah, I'm going to be doing a lot more of the work. Launching a woodpecker right now. And I'll be recording as I do that, so we can dive in a lot deeper on a lot of these nuances when I can actually show you, okay, here I'm mixing up a pile. This is what I'm doing and why, and yada, yada, yada. When I'm just talking about it, I'm just talking about it. So those are some initial thoughts on compost. I'm really stoked about compost. I hope y'all are too. I'm also really stoked to be getting some materials. Part of what's been a limiting factor for me is getting enough materials out here to compost, especially carbon. That's why you can see I've started to accumulate some carbon here. I've got some relationships going now with some local tree companies and whatnot, and starting to try to pick up food scraps in town, which I think is going to help a lot as far as the green material. Obviously, I can harvest a certain amount of green material out here. And yeah, we'll just see where it goes. I'm excited to get into it. Excited to share it. Wherever you're at, where you're tuning into this, I hope you're having a good time. Maybe you're composting. Maybe you're thinking about composting. And yeah, I'll catch you in the next one.